think we've all heard that stress is bad for us. We've seen these pictures intended to frighten us, and indeed they are frightening. You see the nice, really plump brain on the left. It says healthy or control, and then you see the brain that says stressed above it on the right, and it's like withered. Or we see that the hippocampus, an area involved in memory, is smaller. People that are stressed. We see that the Alzheimer's brain is made worse by stress, that people who have a predisposition to schizophrenia, when they get stressed, higher incidence of schizophrenic episodes. You hear that addicts will relapse when they're stressed. I mean, okay, we get it. And it's very important, but I think we've all heard now so many times that stress is bad. But in that conversation, unfortunately, it's eclipsed some of the really positive things that stress does for us in the short term. So stress can be short-term, medium-term, or long-term. Long-term stress is indeed bad for all the reasons I just mentioned and many others. But what's never actually been discussed is what stress is so terrific for, positive for in the short term. And I think we tend to overlook the important question, which is what is short-term and what is long-term? No one ever bothers to tell us what is chronic, what is acute, right? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 5 days? Is it for the duration of final exams? Or is it for the duration of a senior thesis in college? No one actually draws boundaries around this stuff or even general guidelines. And so it's become a bit of a mess, frankly, to try and decipher this whole space around stress. So I'm going to try and clean some of this up for you based on what we know from the scientific data. First of all, acute stress. When the stress response hits, that is good for your immune system. I know that might be a tough pill to swallow, but it's absolutely true. In fact, stress often comes in the form of bacterial or viral infection. And the stress response is in part organized to combat bacterial and viral infection. There are pathways from the same brain centers that activate these neurons in your spinal cord to make you feel like you want to move. There are other neurons in your brain that activate things like your spleen, which will deploy killer cells to go out and scavenge for incoming bacteria and viruses and try and eat them up and kill them. So short-term stress and the release of adrenaline in particular, or epinephrine, same thing, adrenaline, epinephrine, is good for combating infection. And this to me is just not discussed enough, so that's why I'm discussing it here. And it relates to a particular tool that many of you ask about, but I don't often get the opportunity to talk about in such an appropriate context. It's not that it's ever inappropriate to talk about, but what I'm about to talk about now is the use of, again, respiration, breathing, to somewhat artificially activate the stress response, and that will accomplish two things, okay? I'll return to medium and long-term stress, but I want to say short-term stress is good because the dilation of the pupils, the changes in the optics of the eyes, the quickening of the heart rate, the sharpening of your cognition, and in fact, that short-term stress brings certain elements of the brain online that allow you to focus. Now, it narrows your focus. You're not good at seeing the so-called big picture, but it narrows your focus. It allows you to do these, what I call duration path outcome types of analysis. It allows you to evaluate your environment, evaluate what you need to do. It primes your whole system for better cognition. It primes your immune system to combat infection. And that all makes sense when you think about the fact that famine, thirst, bacterial infections, viral infections, invaders, all of this stuff liberates a response in the body that's designed to get you to fight back against whatever stressor that happens to be, psychological, physical, bacterial, viral. Again, the stress response is generic. The tool takes advantage of the fact that when adrenaline is released in the body from the adrenals, it has the effect of also liberating a lot of these killer cells from the immune organs, in particular from the spleen, but from elsewhere as well, and interactions with the lymphatic system that combat infection. The way this works in the real world is best captured by a study that can be mapped back to so-called Wim Hof breathing. Now, Wim Hof breathing is so named after the so-called Iceman, Wim Hof. Wim, of course, being this Dutch, his self-titled daredevil, and indeed he has many, many Guinness Book of World Records for things like swimming under icebergs and going up Kilimanjaro in his shorts and crossing the desert, without water, etc. Things that are quite dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. And Wim obviously survived, or I'm telling you he survived. But there are two components to a sort of breathing protocol that he developed that was based also on what's called Tummo breathing, T-U-M-M-O. So before Wim, there was Tummo breathing. And many people call this now superoxygenation breathing, although the breath work aficionados will probably say, well, it's not superoxygenation because you're also blowing off a lot of carbon dioxide. What I'm talking about here, regardless of whether or not it's called Wim Hof, Tummo, or superoxygenation, is rapid, deliberate breathing. So it's deliberate hyperventilation. Why would somebody want to do this? Well, deliberate hyperventilation done for maybe 25 cycles. So inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Typically it's done in through the nose, out through the mouth, although sometimes it's just through the mouth. If you do that for 15 breaths, 20 breaths, 25 breaths, you will feel very alert. People who have anxiety will feel anxious. They might even have an anxiety attack. However, we need to ask why that kind of breathing feels that way. And it's because that pattern of breathing, rapid movements of the diaphragm, will liberate adrenaline from the adrenals. So it's the release of adrenaline. I mentioned that Wim is also called the Iceman. Well, that's because he actually discovered this pattern of breathing somewhat. And again, it maps back to Tummo breathing by going into cold water. When you go into cold water, that too is a stressor, and you liberate adrenaline in response to cold water. So if you get into an ice bath or a cold shower, you will immediately release adrenaline from your adrenals. Now, there are all sorts of things related to this about psychological control and stress thresholds that we'll talk about. But I really want people to understand that when adrenaline is released in the body, you are in a better position to combat infections. And so whether or not you breathe very quickly in these cycles of 25 breaths, and regardless of what you call it, doesn't matter, adrenaline is released. If you take a cold shower, adrenaline is released. If you go into an ice bath deliberately, and even if you do it non-deliberately, adrenaline is released. You are mimicking the stress response. And that adrenaline serves to suppress or combat incoming infections. And this was beautifully shown in a study that was published in a very fine journal, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences for the U.S. It's literally called Proceedings of the National Academy of USA to distinguish it from other proceedings of other national academies in other countries. The way the experiment went is that people were injected with endotoxin, or in some cases they were injected with a bacterial wall that mimics infection. It gives you a fever. It makes you feel nauseous. It makes you feel sick. It is not pleasant. Half of the people did a particular pattern of breathing that looked very much like the pattern of breathing I described a moment ago, of doing 25 deep inhales and exhales, followed by an exhale, holding their breath, then repeating 25 inhales, exhales, holding their breath. So this would look something like this, or if you're listening, it sounds like 25, 30 times. You'll start feeling heated up. You'll start feeling the adrenaline response. You're liberating adrenaline in your body. Then exhale, hold your breath for 15 seconds, and then repeat. And then typically after doing 3 or 4 rounds of that, they would inhale very deeply and hold their breath. Now, I want to emphasize, never, ever, ever do this anywhere near water. People have passed out, so-called shallow water blackout. People have died. Don't do it in the bathtub. Do it in the hot tub. Don't do it before swimming. Please don't do it anywhere near water. Please don't do it at all unless you get clearance to do it from your doctor, because there are some pulmonary effects and whatnot. And the breath holds should definitely not be done by anyone that has glaucoma or pressure, concerns for the eyes. But these repeated cycles of breathing that liberate adrenaline allowed the group that did that protocol to essentially experience 0 symptoms from the injection of this E. coli, which is remarkable. They had much reduced or no symptoms. They didn't feel feverish. They didn't feel sick. They weren't vomiting, no diarrhea, which is remarkable, but makes total sense when you think about the fact that the short-term stress response, that what's typically called the acute stress response, is designed to combat all stressors. In fact, were you to cut yourself very deeply while out on a hike in the woods, the other thing that would happen is that there would be a rapid inflammation response. And we always hear inflammation is bad. Inflammation gives us Alzheimer's. Inflammation is the worst thing. But the swelling is associated, the inflammation is associated with the recruitment of things like macrophages or microglia, if it's a neural tissue, cells in our brain and body whose job is to act like little ambulances and rush to that site and clean it up. And indeed, the inflammation response looks horrible, it sounds horrible, but it's a great thing in the short term. You want to have that tissue marked as in trouble, and you want the body and brain to react to it. So if you're getting peaks in stress from time to time throughout your day or throughout your week, you are in a better position to combat infection. You are in a better position to heal your wounds, physical wounds. Many great things happen in the stress response. Now, of course, the stress response isn't always super intense. Sometimes it's milder. Sometimes it allows us to just focus on something because we have a deadline. That can feel stressful, but that's one of the reasons you procrastinators out there, people are always asking me, what can be done for procrastination? What can be done for procrastination is you can understand what's happening, which is that you are self-imposing stress because stress acts like a drug. It is a powerful nootropic. I get asked about nootropics. The most powerful nootropic or smart drug is stress. It's the concern of failure. It's the desire to do well. It's the impending deadline. It's the, oh my gosh, I have to do this thing now or I'm going to fail. That is the best nootropic you will ever find. That combined with a good night's sleep, which we'll talk about. But we spent a whole month on sleep, so I don't want to backtrack too much. Okay, so short-term stress, great. The key is to be able to turn the stress response off when you're done, when you don't want that.